Hello friends, this is Shayla from Shayla G Photography, and today is the day that we learn to use our cameras in manual. I'm so excited. Let's start with a review of what we learned so far because we're going to put it all together. So find where I don't have a reflection. In lesson number 1, we learned about aperture. That is what allows us to get that creamy, dreamy background where our subject pops out. Then we have shutter speed, which is what allows us to either capture movement or freeze motion. And then we have ISO, which is what controls the sensitivity of our camera's sensor to light. And when we put all of those together, it makes up the exposure triangle. Exposure is the amount of light in our image. So we want to go for a perfect exposure. That's what we're learning here today, which based on our camera's meter is going to read 0.0. A number that is negative would be underexposed, meaning more dark than light. And a number that is positive, higher than 0.0, is going to be overexposed, meaning there's more light than dark. Some photographers shoot underexposed as a matter of preference, and some shoot overexposed as a matter of preference. We're going to work with 0.0 today, and once you know what you're doing, and you will start developing your own style and your own preferences, and you can shoot overexposed or underexposed or perfectly exposed, whatever your preference is. But today we're just going to learn for 0.0. When we think about what these three components have in common, the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, they all control the amount of light that comes into the camera's sensor. So with aperture and shutter speed, we have some creative control. And while we adjust those, there's an interplay with the other two. So if we think about aperture, which is how wide the opening is that allows light in through the lens, if we have a very large opening, we get that very shallow depth of field, that creamy, dreamy background that lets our subject pop. We're letting a lot of light in. So if it's a really bright day, we're going to need to use a lower ISO in order to keep that sensor from being too absorbent of light. And we may need to use a faster shutter speed to decrease the amount of time that the sensor is open to light. Using shutter speed as an example, if we're taking pictures with a very fast shutter speed because we want to freeze motion, then we are decreasing the amount of light coming into the camera's sensor and may need to use a wider aperture or increase the ISO on our camera to increase the sensitivity to light. If we are using a slower shutter speed to capture movement in our photo, then we may need to stop down our aperture, close that hole up a little more to decrease the amount of light coming in through the lens, or decrease the sensitivity of the sensor to light by lowering our ISO. So there is an interplay amongst all three of these things, and when you adjust one, it affects the other two. Okay, friends, we are on location. It is midday, so definitely not golden hour. We have beautiful blue sky going on, which is my absolute favorite. I love me a good blue sky day. A little bit of white clouds going on, and then I'll tip you back. We got full sunshine. So this is a great scenario for you to learn my thought process and how I decide what I'm going to put my settings at when I walk out into a sunshiny day. Let's move to the camera. I am using a tripod today just because it's much easier for filming. Normally, if I were out here doing this just for funsies for myself, I would not put this on a tripod. And what I'm going to make the subject of my photo is that fuzzy grassy guy right there. He's enough out in front of the other fuzzy grassy guys that I can make him pop from my background. So I want to have more of that creamy, dreamy background with my subject popping. So we know that I'm going to need to make my aperture a wide aperture. So the smaller number, wider opening, right? And that's going to let in the maximum amount of light that the lens can let in. So with it being full bright sun, we're going to need to use the other avenues, the ISO and the shutter speed, to decrease the amount of light coming in. Okay, today is the day for manual, so please make sure that your dial is set to manual. Mine is an M, yours is probably an M, but if you do not have M as an option, please Google it or look it up on your owner's manual and find out what manual is on your camera. Now let's look at the back of my screen and see what happens when we make all the adjustments we want to make. If you look at this monitor, this is exactly the image we would get if we clicked the button right now. It is very blown out. There's a little bit of definition, so there would be a little bit of a picture, but it would be mostly white. So what do we want to do? We know that we want the creamy, dreamy background with our subject popping out. So first thing we'll do is make our aperture the largest opening we can, which is the smallest number, which on this lens is 2.8. So what did that do? Well, it let more light into the sensor and completely blew out the image. You can't see really any definition now, so that just made it worse. But let's see. We're going to think about it. The other two things we have to adjust are ISO and shutter speed. It is a very, very bright sunny day right now, so I'm going to drop my ISO as low as I can. Let's get that down to 100 and see if that helps. Boom, we are at 100. It definitely did help. You can see the outline of the weeds and the vegetation going on there, but we're still at above 2.0 for exposure. We are still very overexposed here. So what is the last thing we can change to adjust the light? Well, that's our shutter speed. So if I were hand holding my camera, I would need that to be at least 1 over the focal length of the lens. This lens is a zoom lens. It goes from 70 millimeters all the way out to 180. So I would want to have it at least 1 over 180 or 1 over 200, be about as close as you could get that. I'm going to shoot at the 70 millimeter just because that's a good distance from where I'm set up. And we are not hand holding, so we don't necessarily need that, but it's something I would think about if I were adjusting this and hand holding my camera. However, we just need to get less light into the lens to balance our exposure, so we are going to raise that shutter speed. We're just going to keep raising it until our exposure says 0.0. There we go. At 1 over 1250, we have a perfect exposure. And I love this. You can see that that weedy guy is beautifully backlit. The sunshine is just coming right through it and giving it a nice outline. So I'm going to make sure that I lock exposure on this weedy guy. Right there you can see my green bracket. And I'm going to take my picture and then we'll throw it up on the screen and see what we get. This is what we came for. Our subject is popping out from that nice creamy background. We have perfect exposure. Love it. Okay, so I have walked down the road to a shady spot. This is quite a bit darker, but it's still the same beautiful sunny day. The sun is back behind us in the, behind those trees. You can see some spots of light back here behind us on the ground coming through the trees, but overall it's quite a bit darker here than it was where our last shot was. I left the camera set up to the same settings that we just had for the last image, and I've picked a new weedy subject to photograph, so we will walk through the process of setting that image up now. Okay, it is definitely easier to see this screen when it's darker than brighter. This time we are way underexposed. We're below -2.0. And if we took an image right now, it would be mostly black. There's a little bit of definition in there, but it would be almost completely dark versus our last one would have been completely blown out. So let's think about our goal. Again, we're making a weed our subject. So we want to keep that wide open aperture so that we have that creamy, dreamy background and our subject pops. But do we need our shutter speed all the way up to 1 over 1250? No, we are not photographing an Olympic runner and trying to freeze their motion. We've got a mostly still subject. So let's make that down to 1 over 200, which works with the length of lens we're using. And actually, the camera's like, winner, winner, chicken dinner. You are on perfect exposure. So I am going to, again, catch focus on my weed and snap the picture. That was a little easier than I expected it to be. I thought maybe we'd have to adjust ISO. So let's practice that too. If for some reason we were using a longer lens and we needed like a 300 millimeter lens and we needed a faster shutter speed, well look, now we're at -0.7. So we could raise our ISO and make this sensor more sensitive to light, which would also give us that perfect exposure. Catch focus, boom. So we do have options. It's not just a one and done situation. You got to think through what you're doing and why. All right, I had to walk out into the sun again because it's It's kind of chilly in the shade. I moved to South Carolina from a northern state about 11 months ago, and now I'm really I'm not tough enough for the cold. I grew up in Montana. They would never let me back there based on my wimpiness for the cold. Rightfully so. All right, so I just want to go over some thought processes for when you walk outside or inside, wherever you're going to go to take your pictures. The first thing I usually do is decide what my goal is. A large majority of the time, my goal is a shallow depth of field. I want my subject to pop. So I'm generally setting my aperture first. So again, if I'm finding the perfect weed to photograph, as I've been showing here, I'm going to set my aperture on the smallest number, which is the largest opening, which is the shallowest depth of field. Then I'm going to think about my shutter speed second. And then I'm going to set my ISO last. I always want my ISO to be the lowest it can while achieving my goals with aperture and shutter speed. As we saw in the really bright light, I may need to raise my shutter speed to a faster shutter speed if I still can't achieve my goal with ISO. Or if I'm photographing a family and there's going to be 3 rows of people, I'm going to need a greater depth of field because I want to make sure that the people in front, their eyes are in focus, and the people in back, their eyes are in focus. So I can't have this sliver of focus when I've got 3 rows of family. So I'm going to need that larger depth of field. I'm also going to need to make sure that my shutter speed is probably at least 1/250 to make sure that I'm not getting like blurry hands if people move their hand at all or something like that. It's kind of distracting in a portrait. So I may need to crank my ISO a little bit higher if we're doing this in low light. So that's a scenario where, okay, ISO is the thing I need to adjust. Another thing is if I'm taking a picture of my kid running in a track meet and I want to make sure that I like freeze them mid-stride, then I'm definitely going to want a faster shutter speed, probably like 1/640 or 1/1250. If track meet is in full sun, then ISO 100 may be perfect. If the track meet is in the evening and it's pretty dark, then I really may need to raise that ISO quite a bit. So know what your goal is and then make your adjustments based on that. If my goal is to get outside and capture some motion, then I'm going to set my shutter speed first to what I want it to be. And then I'm going to choose my aperture. And then I'm going to set my ISO. So you have to get into these scenarios in practice. You're not going to walk into every scenario and be like, oh, got it. I know exactly what I need to do. I never know exactly what my settings are going to be till I adjust them one at a time. And then another thing you need to think about is that lighting changes. So I'm outside in the full sun, but the sun could go behind a tree or behind a cloud, and bam, I'm going to need to change my settings again to get to that perfect exposure. So it's good to keep reminding yourself that you may need to change it as your lighting changes, and that's okay. And another thing to think about is sometimes in photography forums, I will see newer beginner photographers asking what other photographers used for their settings in particular images. And while that's good from a learning perspective, it's not good in the thought process of, I'm just going to set my settings how they had them and then I can get that same picture. Because we don't know what their lighting scenario was compared to your lighting scenario. If you under or overexpose an image, you can make it look brighter or darker than it really was. So it's better for you to figure out how to adjust your own settings so that you can get the image you want every single time. And that's going to take practice. But I guess the beauty of photography is that it is more rewarding the harder you had to work for it. So, go out there and work for it and get those images that make you just really proud. Let me know what your questions are because I would love to answer those for you and help you figure out what it is that you're struggling with. Thank you for staying with me today and learning how to use our cameras on manual. I will see you next time. This is Shayla with Shayla G Photography. Please hit the subscribe button, hit the follow button to be notified of future episodes, and let me know what kind of questions you have. Have a great day, friends. Bonus content, I thought we would move into the house and try taking a picture of a Christmas tree ornament in the lower indoor light. So you can still see the same bright sunny day is going on outside, but I am indoors without any artificial light and all we have is the light coming through the windows, which makes this fairly dark for a camera. So I thought we would move on from weeds and try to get a picture, well, we're not going to try, we're going to do it, of this little ballerina ornament you can see at the bottom of the screen there. I have the settings on the camera the same as they were for our second weed. So let's follow along and see how we're going to adjust this. So since we want a shallow depth of field, we are going to stick with our lowest aperture of f2.8. That also helps us to bring in the most amount of light with our aperture. So we'll leave that alone. Now I've got the lens, the same lens on. It is zoomed out to 180 millimeters. So we can drop the shutter speed down a little bit to 1/200. That's the closest we can get without going under 1/180. And you can see that we are still way underexposed. We would get the outline of this ornament, but overall it would still be very dark. So the last thing we can increase is the sensor's sensitivity to light. So we're going to raise that ISO until we get to 0.0 for exposure, which we have achieved. You can see an actual image on the screen at ISO 3200. So let's catch focus on our ornament and snap the picture, and we'll see how that looks. If my videos have been helpful to you, please subscribe, hit the bell for future notifications, like and comment. I appreciate you so much.